Morality meets law in today's episode of The Deep Dive. From prostitution to drug policy, we explore how society polices behavior in the name of public order and whether the law should reflect values, harm, or both.
Welcome back.
Today, we're plunging into a stack of sources, focusing on excerpts from a criminology text that tackles a fundamental question. How does society use the law to regulate behavior, especially those acts often labeled public order crimes?
That's right. We're looking at the complex interplay between law, morality, and social policy, digging into some really controversial areas like sexual behavior and substance abuse.
Our mission in this deep dive is to really get to the heart of how prevailing moral rules and societal views shape what gets designated as criminal.
Yeah, we want to understand the long-standing debates about whether the law should primarily represent a shared sense of morality, focus strictly on preventing social harm, or, navigate some tricky middle ground.
Okay, let's dive straight into that core debate the sources lay out. They start by defining what are often called public order crimes, or sometimes, perhaps misleadingly, victimless crimes.
And right away, the sources highlight why victimless can be problematic. I mean, these aren't like theft or assault where the harm feels immediate and direct.
Right.
These are acts seen as disrupting the general functioning of society, conflicting with social policy, commonly held moral rules, and public opinion.
Exactly. And this is where the philosophical tension really emerges. One major view, represented by someone like Sir Patrick Devlin, argues that a society needs a shared sense of public morality. And the criminal law serves a vital function in expressing and upholding that shared sense.
Almost like the law is the glue that holds society together by reinforcing common values.
Precisely. Devlin felt that without agreement on fundamental ideas of good and evil, society could actually start to, unravel. He saw a common morality as the invisible bonds of society, arguing that upholding it is the price of society. You accept limitations on personal freedom to maintain the social fabric.
So if you engage in behavior that violates this common morality, you're not just making a personal choice, you're seen as weakening the whole group. Is that the idea?
That's the Devlin perspective. But then you have a counterpoint, strongly articulated by scholars like H.L.A. Hart, who really question the idea of using the law to simply legislate morals.
Okay, so what was Hart's concern here?
Hart worried about the potential tyranny of the majority. He felt it was too easy for democratic society to confuse the power the majority holds with the idea that the majority's power is unlimited or inherently just.
Oh, okay.
His concern was that a majority could simply dictate how everyone, even those with different beliefs or lifestyles, must live.
And that raises a massive question, doesn't it? Whose morality are we talking about? How do we even define it?
Exactly. The sources bring up Justice William O. Douglas's famous line, "What may be trash to me may be prized by others."
Right. Is the law punishing genuine social harm, or is it potentially just punishing differences in taste, lifestyle, or personal choices that a majority, disapproves of?
The sources use examples like nudity in classic art are Rubens' paintings or Michelangelo's David Obscene. Most people today would say no, they're celebrated art.
But historically, yeah, ideas about nudity and public display have definitely shifted, so the definition isn't fixed.
And Joseph Gusfield adds another fascinating layer to this debate. He argued that outlawing certain immoral acts isn't always solely about the act itself or even the perceived harm. It can also be about the groups condemning those acts.
How so? What did he mean by that?
Gusfield suggested that by crusading against certain behaviors and making them illegal, the groups pushing for those laws can actually enhance their own social status.
Oh, interesting. So they demonstrate their perceived moral superiority over those they condemn.
Exactly, using the law as a tool to reinforce social hierarchies and their place within them.
So the law isn't just a neutral rule book. It can be a battleground for social values and a way for groups to assert their identity and position.
That's a crucial insight the sources provide. Now, bringing you back to the idea of harm, the common justification for outlawing acts is that they're believed to be significantly harmful to the general public.
Acts seen as harming only the individual doing them are often tolerated more.
That seems logical. Don't hurt others. Pretty straightforward, right?
But here's one of those interesting contradictions the sources point out that challenges that logic.
Okay.
If social harm is the primary basis for criminal law, why are things like tobacco, alcohol, and, fast cars, which contribute to vastly more deaths and measurable harm than most illegal drugs, perfectly legal?
That's a really good point. It really makes you question the consistency of harm as the sole or even primary principle behind which behaviors we criminalize.
It absolutely does. So, keeping this tension in mind between reflecting morality, preventing perceived harm, and these underlying social dynamics, let's look at how the law has actually applied these ideas in specific areas.
Okay.
The first major area our sources cover is what conventional society has historically considered deviant sexual practices.
And the history here shows a significant evolution in attitudes and laws. The sources touch on homosexuality, noting its presence throughout history, including mentions in ancient texts, and the historical roots of discriminatory terms like sodomy.
And that historical intolerance has translated into significant legal and social discrimination that, persists globally in varying degrees even today.
Looking at the legal landscape around the time our sources were compiled, there were real contradictions. You had federal laws like the Defense of Marriage Act from 1996 defining marriage exclusively. And many states doing the same, reflecting a sort of Devlin-like desire to legally reinforce a traditional moral view of marriage.
But simultaneously, the sources point to a powerful counter-movement reflecting Hart's concerns about individual liberty. You saw courts like the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court in 2003, ruling that same-sex couples did have the right to marry under the state constitution, seeing denying that right as a form of unequal treatment.
And similar rulings emerged internationally, like in Canada. Yet there was significant political pushback, with many states passing constitutional amendments banning same-sex marriage in response around that time.
Yeah, it was a period of intense legal and social conflict over whose definition of marriage, whose set of moral values should be written into law.
The sources also mention the military's don't ask, don't tell policy as another example of navigating this complex issue.
Right, another compromise, sort of.
And the changing landscape for gay parents in child custody cases, which was also evolving.
But the big legal shifts that truly exemplify the Hart perspective, the idea of individual liberty in private conduct, came from the Supreme Court.
Right. Two pivotal cases stand out. First, Romer v. Evans in 1996.
Okay, what happened there?
The court struck down a Colorado constitutional amendment that would have prevented any civil rights protections for gay people. The court said a state couldn't just single out a group for unfavorable legal treatment.
Wow.
Essentially calling them strangers to the law.
So that ruling said you can't just ban rights based on status or perceived group characteristics alone. That's significant.
And then, perhaps even more significantly, Lawrence v. Texas in 2003.
Oh, yes, Lawrence. That overturned Bowers, right?
Exactly. It directly overturned Bowers v. Hardwick from 1986, which had upheld a state law criminalizing consensual sodomy. Lawrence made it unconstitutional for states to criminalize private, consensual sexual acts between adults, including same-sex adults, in their homes.
That decision was a clear statement that the state's interest in enforcing a particular moral code did not outweigh an individual's liberty and privacy in their intimate lives.
Yeah, the court used powerful language about the liberty of persons to choose without being punished as criminals.
It marked a major shift towards the idea that private, consensual adult behavior is generally outside the reach of criminal law, even if it conflicts with some moral views.
However, the sources correctly point out that legal disparities didn't vanish overnight. They cite a 2004 case, State v. Lamont, where sentencing for sex with a minor still showed a difference based on the minor's sex.
So progress on some fronts, but the effects of historical biases can definitely linger in the legal system. It's not always a clean break.
Beyond consensual acts, the sources also touch on paraphilias as another area where law intersects with sexual behavior.
Right. They define paraphilias and list various examples, things like voyeurism or sadomasochism.
And the critical distinction the law makes here isn't the label itself, but whether the behavior involves social harm or, crucially, unwilling or underage victims.
Exactly. Private, consensual expressions of a paraphilia are generally not criminalized. But acts involving non-consenting individuals or, heartbreakingly children, those are subject to severe penalties under laws against assault, indecent exposure, or specific statutes against child sexual abuse.
And the sources connect this directly to devastating real-world examples like the clergy abuse scandals, highlighting the immense and undeniable harm caused by acts like pedophilia.
It really underscores that the line between private behavior and criminal conduct is often drawn based on consent and harm to others, even when the behavior might be rooted in a paraphilia.
Okay, another major area classified under public order crimes is prostitution. The history is surprisingly long and varied.
It really is. Goes way back to ancient Mesopotamia and Greece, where it sometimes even had religious or civic ties, like funding temples.
Wow. And early Christianity initially tolerated it as a necessary evil before later banning it. Quite a shift.
And the definition in the sources is simple but key: granting non-marital sexual access by mutual agreement for payment. They note it's sexually neutral in its definition.
It's framed as a commercial transaction with a sexual element for the buyer and an economic exchange for the seller.
Right. While the sources note a decline in clients over the past 50 years, maybe due to the sexual revolution and STDs, arrests have remained relatively stable, around 80,000 annually, according to the text.
And a deeply concerning statistic mentioned is the number of minors arrested annually, over 1,000 under 18, many very young.
Yeah, that directly challenges any notion of this being victimless and points to significant potential harm and exploitation.
Absolutely. And this becomes even more stark when looking at the international sex trade, which the sources highlight as a major global issue.
We're talking about sex tourism, where individuals from wealthier countries exploit vulnerable people, often young girls, in poorer nations like Thailand.
And the scale of human trafficking described is just staggering. Hundreds of thousands of women and children lured or forced into exploitation globally.
It is horrific.
With estimates of tens of thousands trafficked to the U.S. each year.
The sources specifically detail the Natasha trade, focusing on young women from former Soviet republics trapped in a multi-billion-dollar market.
How do they get trapped?
Recruiters use deceit, fake job ads, marriage agencies, and then traffickers maintain control through violence, threats to family, seizing documents, and creating inescapable debt. It's modern slavery.
These women are trapped, forced into labor under horrific conditions with little ability to seek help from authorities in the countries they're taken to.
Yeah, it paints a very clear picture of profound harm, definitely not a victimless transaction.
The sources also break down different facets of prostitution within a country like the U.S., from streetwalkers facing extreme danger but developing survival skills.
Right, often the most visible and vulnerable.
To brothel prostitutes in legal areas like parts of Nevada, to more hidden forms like call girls catering to higher-end clients, or even cyber prostitutes operating online.
This variety shows that prostitution isn't monolithic, and the reasons people become involved also vary quite a bit.
How so?
While studies on U.S. street-level workers often point to backgrounds of trauma, abuse, and lack of opportunity, but research in poorer nations highlights economic necessity more strongly.
Like single mothers trying to support families, needing flexible work, despite all the risks involved.
Exactly. So you have complex individual factors and powerful global economic pressures at play.
Controlling prostitution has clearly proven difficult. Historically, there were attempts at regulation, like licensing and medical checks.
Yeah, trying to manage it rather than ban it.
But these often shifted to outright prohibition, fueled by concerns about disease or perceived morality, especially around wartime.
Modern efforts range from local containment strategies using patrols and zoning laws to federal laws like the Mann Act aimed at interstate trafficking.
But prosecuting international trafficking, as we mentioned, is notoriously difficult due to jurisdictional issues and gathering evidence abroad.
And this difficulty in control leads naturally to the legalization debate, which the sources explore. There are different perspectives, even within movements like feminism.
Right. One feminist view sees prostitution as inherently exploitative, a product of male dominance, viewing prostitutes as victims.
While another free choice view argues that, if freely chosen, it can be an expression of women's economic autonomy and shouldn't be criminalized.
Interesting. And both these views often lean towards decriminalization, reducing or eliminating penalties for the prostitutes themselves, rather than full legalization with regulation.
Right. Fearing regulation might just increase state control over women, ironically.
Arguments for legalization often point out that it's an ancient practice, that people will find ways to engage in it anyway, and that prohibition creates dangerous criminal networks.
They suggest legalization could bring it under public health control, potentially reduce associated crime, and generate tax revenue. Some proponents cite examples like legal brothels in parts of Europe or Nevada.
And the arguments against legalization
Often fear it would increase demand and normalization, leading to more widespread participation and potential exploitation. They point to historical examples of widespread addiction enabled by legal availability, and worry about increased public health issues or difficulty controlling access for vulnerable populations like teens.
It's a complex debate with no easy answers. weighing concerns about personal liberty, public health, economic factors, and the potential for exploitation.
Absolutely. The sources even connect the survival skills of streetwalkers to concepts like rational choice theory. The idea that even in incredibly difficult circumstances, individuals are making choices based on perceived costs and benefits, however grim they might be.
Okay, let's shift gears to the next area our sources cover: pornography.
Right. Another area where law, morality, and harm collide. The sources define pornography literally writing about prostitutes from Greek.
Interesting origin.
And note its visibility in stores, video, and especially the internet, with hundreds of thousands of websites mentioned even back then.
And the core legal issue isn't nudity or sex itself, which can be legal, but obscenity.
Exactly. Obscene material is prohibited. But the massive problem is, how do you define obscenity?
That's the million-dollar question, right? The sources mention historical examples like Ulysses or Lady Chatterley's Lover, once banned, now considered literature.
And Justice Potter Stewart's famous line about obscenity, "I know it when I see it," which basically highlights the subjectivity.
That ambiguity has allowed a huge industry to flourish, billions of dollars annually.
But there's also the concern raised by some that vague anti-obscenity statutes could be used to limit free speech or political dissent, though others like Irving Kristol argued against that specific risk.
The most controversial aspect, of course, is child pornography.
Absolutely indefensible. The sources mention the horrific use of potentially over 1 million children annually, many runaways, causing devastating physical and psychological harm. This isn't about free speech, it's about child abuse.
And that raises the debate. Does pornography, specifically adult pornography, cause violence?
The evidence seems mixed, according to the sources. They mention Ted Bundy's claims, but also a study by Malamuth suggesting frequent use isn't linked to aggression unless the person already has high-risk factors.
Yeah.
But exposure to violent pornographic themes was linked to increased sexual violence by viewers. It's a complex relationship, maybe tying back to media effects discussed elsewhere.
So how does the law handle pornography? State and federal laws prohibit obscenity.
And child pornography is treated as a distinct, very serious category, sexual exploitation of minors. There are federal felonies for trafficking, producing, distributing it, even luring minors online.
But defining obscenity for adults legally has been a long struggle. Early cases tried to protect ideas unless they were utterly without redeeming social importance.
Which proved very hard to meet. The key case became Miller v. California in 1973.
Right, the Miller test. What did that establish?
It set up a three-part test. A, would the average person applying contemporary community standards find the work appeals to the prurient interest?
Okay.
B, does it depict or describe in a patently offensive way sexual conduct specifically defined by state law?
And C.
C, does the work, taken as a whole, lack serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value? The LAPS test.
So it needs to fail all three parts to be obscene.
Essentially, yes. Though later cases clarified the value part should be judged by a reasonable person standard, not just local community standards. But ambiguity remains, especially with varying community standards.
Controlling it beyond child pornography has proven difficult. Zoning laws have been one tool.
Yeah, like in the Young v. American Mini Theaters case, upholding zoning for adult businesses. The Times Square cleanup in NYC is cited as an example.
Restricting where these businesses can operate, trying to contain the perceived negative effects.
But the internet obviously poses a massive challenge to these kinds of controls. The sources mention early attempts like the Child Pornography Prevention Act trying to ban virtual child porn.
Which the Supreme Court partially struck down.
Right, citing free speech concerns over banning images that didn't involve real children. It highlights the ongoing legal battles in the digital age.
Okay, let's transition to the second broad area of public order crime: substance abuse.
A huge social issue, as the sources emphasize, affecting all parts of the U.S. and many other countries, deeply tied into crime, violence, and gangs.
And the history of trying to control substances through law in the U.S. is particularly telling, highlighted by the era of alcohol prohibition.
Yeah, that period, driven by the temperance movement in the early 20th century, was really a clash of cultures, wasn't it?
It seems so. Groups like the Anti-Saloon League, often backed by Protestant clergy, saw the growing urban populations and immigrant communities as a threat to a perceived rural agrarian morality.
And the 18th Amendment, prohibiting the manufacture, sale, or transport of alcohol, was a clear attempt to legislate this particular moral viewpoint nationally. A real Devlin-esque move.
But prohibition, despite being called a noble experiment, was widely seen as a failure. Why did it fail so badly?
Several reasons. Organized crime quickly moved in to supply the massive demand. Also, the law only banned selling, not buying or possessing for personal use, which limited its practical impact.
And enforcement.
Simply inadequate and often riddled with corruption. Think Eliot Ness, but he was the exception, not the rule.
So the 21st Amendment finally repealed it in 1933.
Right. Acknowledging that trying to prohibit a widely desired substance was ineffective and had significant negative consequences, like fueling organized crime, a classic example of the limits of using law to control personal behavior driven by strong demand.
Looking at the extent of substance abuse more broadly, the sources provide data showing trends over time.
Yeah, figures showed a decline from the 80s to the early 90s, then an increase, then some stabilization or decline for teens around the time the text was written.
Marijuana consistently shows up as the most widely used illicit drug.
Right, though perceived danger fluctuated. Ecstasy saw increases, then declines. Alcohol use seemed relatively stable since the 90s, but binge drinking rates among teens were notably high.
The data from around 2003 indicate about 19.5 million Americans aged 12 or older were current illicit drug users. That's about 8% of the population then.
And marijuana was the most common, with a significant number using it daily.
The sources briefly run through the different categories of drugs: barbiturates, tranquilizers, amphetamines like meth, cannabis, hallucinogens, narcotics like heroin, steroids, alcohol, and the rise of club drugs like ecstasy or GHB.
Just outlining the landscape of substances involved.
When it comes to the causes of substance abuse, the sources suggest it's rarely one single factor. Peer influence is mentioned as a significant predictor, especially for adolescents.
Psychological factors, too, like impaired cognition or personality issues, problems that can affect people across all social classes.
And biological or genetic predispositions, along with family history, are also seen as contributing factors.
Yeah.
It seems very multifaceted.
Definitely. The sources also touch on the popular drug gateway theory, the idea that using softer drugs like marijuana or alcohol inevitably leads to harder ones like heroin or crack.
But they cast some doubt on that.
Yeah, they point out that research doesn't fully support this as a universal rule. Many hardcore users never started with marijuana or alcohol. And the vast majority of marijuana users do not go on to use crack or heroin. As one expert in CRD is quoted, there are probably as many reasons people use drugs as there are individuals who use drugs.
So it's a complex phenomenon with multiple potential pathways, not a simple linear progression we can assume for everyone.
Exactly. The sources then explore the various types of drug users and their connection to crime.
They describe different profiles, right? Like youth who start using early and become adult offenders.
Often having other developmental issues, too. Then there are seemingly respectable, high-level dealers who blend in, making huge profits.
And others like stabilized junkies who manage to maintain relatively normal lives, but might deal to support their habit.
Versus less predatory offenders who commit petty crimes like shoplifting or bad checks, often occasional users whose crime level relates to the drug cost.
The assumed link between drugs and crime is obviously a major justification for criminalizing drug use itself.
Absolutely. Research consistently shows that many people who commit crimes also use drugs, and active drug users are responsible for a significant amount of crime, particularly property crime to fund addiction.
And alcohol, too, is heavily linked to violent crime and fatal accidents. The sources mention figures like 4 out of 10 violent crimes involving alcohol.
But there's still a debate on causation, isn't there? Does drug use cause someone to become a criminal?
Or are people who are already predisposed to crime just more likely to use drugs?
Or does drug use primarily facilitate or amplify criminal behavior in those already involved?
What do the sources suggest?
They seem to lean towards that last idea, amplification. They suggest that while many offenders are users, drug use, particularly addiction, tends to increase the frequency and seriousness of their criminal activities.
Makes sense. Addiction requires money, which often drives property crime, and being under the influence can lower inhibitions, potentially leading to more reckless or violent acts.
Right. Studies, whether surveying addicts directly or known offenders in the justice system, show a really strong association. One Miami study found a relatively small group of addicts was responsible for a massive number of crimes in a single year.
And surveys of inmates consistently show high rates of lifetime drug use, and many being under the influence when they committed their last offense.
So the relationship is complex, but drug use definitely seems to play a significant role in the lives and criminal activities of many offenders.
The sources also point out that drug use can interfere with crucial developmental stages, like finishing school, getting stable employment, forming healthy social bonds.
Things that normally act as protective factors against criminal behavior. Weakening those bonds can lead towards antisocial behavior.
Regarding drugs in the law, federal involvement started way back, initially focused on labeling and restricting specific narcotics, and later adding marijuana to the controlled list.
Then things really ramped up later. Modern laws, particularly from the Anti-Drug Abuse Acts of the 1980s, introduced much harsher penalties.
Mandatory minimum sentences.
Right, and created institutions like the Drug Czar to coordinate a national enforcement effort. State laws generally followed suit.
Despite decades of these increasingly tough wars on drugs, substance abuse remains a major challenge. The sources raise the fundamental question: can illegal drug use truly be eliminated or effectively controlled through these methods?
It's a fair question. They discuss various strategies employed. Deterrence is a big one, trying to stop the supply by going after source countries, breaking up distribution networks, conducting street-level crackdowns.
But that's hard, right?
Incredibly difficult. The immense profits involved create a powerful incentive, and there's the displacement effect. You crack down in one area, the trade just pops up somewhere else.
There's prevention.
Focusing on education and discouraging use, often targeting youth with say no messages, like the DARE program.
Though the effectiveness of programs like DARE has been debated quite a bit.
Yeah, the sources raise questions about what kind of education works best and who is actually equipped to deliver it effectively. Testing students is also mentioned as a controversial tactic.
And finally, treatment.
Using methods like group therapy, residential programs, and medical interventions like methadone or Naxalone to manage withdrawal and cravings.
But access can be limited. There's stigma and concerns about mixing different types of users during treatment. Voluntary versus court-ordered participation is another issue.
The overall critique from the sources seems to be that the war on drugs, despite massive effort and expense, hasn't been particularly successful in significantly reducing substance abuse.
Why not?
Largely because of the huge profits driving the illegal trade and the inherent difficulty enforcing or persuading users, especially addicted users, to simply stop.
Which brings us back again to the legalization debate, this time specifically for drugs. Ethan Nadelman is mentioned as a proponent.
Right. Arguments for legalization often start with the idea that people have always used mood-altering substances, and prohibition just creates violent criminal enterprises.
They also point out, like we discussed earlier, that legal substances like alcohol and tobacco actually cause far more deaths annually than all illegal drugs combined.
Plus, they argue legalization could reduce the drug crime link, allow for regulation like keeping drugs away from minors or public servants, and generate significant tax revenue.
The Netherlands is sometimes cited as an example, though the source notes this might be a simplification of their policies.
And the arguments against drug legalization.
Concerns that it could lead to a massive increase in overall usage rates, resulting in more non-productive people in society. Worries about higher daily intake if drugs were cheap and easily available.
They point to historical examples, like the opium trade forced on China, as cautionary tales.
And potential public health consequences, like increased impaired driving deaths, maybe from marijuana or other substances. Plus, the worry that adolescents would gain access just as they currently find ways to access legal alcohol.
So the sources conclude that while full legalization might be unlikely in the near term, the ongoing debate highlights the need for continued study into alternative approaches.
Things like partial decriminalization, maybe focusing treatment resources differently, finding more effective ways to address addiction itself, rather than just focusing solely on criminalizing the substance use.
It seems like a search for strategies beyond the traditional war on drugs framework.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we circle back to that core tension we started with. How society defines crime, balancing ideas of law, morality, and perceived social harm.
Yeah, it's clearly not a simple equation.
We've seen how this plays out in controversial areas, from the shifting legal landscape around sexuality, marked by battles over privacy and equality,
to the stark realities of the international sex trade, which clearly demonstrate profound harm, far beyond any notion of simple individual choice.
We've explored the challenges of defining something as subjective as obscenity, especially in the digital age,
and wrestled with the long, often discouraging history of trying to prohibit widely desired substances, culminating in the complex realities and debates surrounding the ongoing wars on drugs.
And throughout, we've seen how the law isn't some static, neutral entity, but but really a reflection of prevailing moral views, sometimes inconsistent ideas of harm, and often a tool used in broader social and cultural dynamics.
It's constantly evolving, constantly being debated and reshaped.
Given all the complexities we've unpacked, the debates about whose morality should hold sway, the difficulty in consistently defining and measuring social harm, and the often limited success of using prohibition to control behavior. Here's a provocative thought for you, the listener, to consider. Where do you believe society should ultimately draw the line between personal behavior and criminal conduct? What principles should guide that crucial decision?